Hello and welcome to Inside Intelligence, brought to you by the Intelligence Analysis Program and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs here at Johns Hopkins University. Today's program features guest Andrew Gilmour, a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, specializing on the Middle East, on the topic of Is the Middle East Primed for New Thinking? My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function, and we'll answer as many of the questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn the event over to our moderator, Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program. Dr. Ard.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is a fascinating and unsettling time to be studying the Middle East. Several nations are jockeying for power and influence. We see Turkey has been reasserting itself in the region. Saudi Arabia is trying to establish a new compact with its people. Several secular nations such as Syria and Iraq are attempting to pick themselves out of the rubble of civil war, and really even their very image of nationhood seems to be in doubt. Iran has been doubling down on its revolution. Israel and other Arab states are recognizing some mutual national security interests. And we have, of course, the non-state actors like Hezbollah and Yemen's Houthis exercising an outside influence themselves. And some would say this represents the continued aftershock of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Or perhaps we should be even taking a longer view of this. Can ancient history and the classics guide us in developing strategic intelligence for the region? With us to explain his idea of new thinking about the Middle East is Andrew Gilmour. Andrew comes from, right now he's a senior scholar at residence at Catholic University Center for Study of Statesmanship. He's a 32-year veteran of the CIA. He had leadership positions there on the National Intelligence Council and also on the Middle East Task Force, principal drafter of 3 national intelligence estimates, and he's the recipient of the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal. His languages include Persian, French, and Ancient Greek, and he holds degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar, and I think your tee-up is really helpful to focus our minds on a region that is in significant transition. And I would like to indeed introduce us to some new ways of thinking about this region. They're new in as much as they don't come from the standard analytic toolkit that I think has, although served us well in the past, is necessarily sufficient for what we're looking at now. When I was in Iraq in 2003, I remember a soldier who had just been on patrol coming up to me and really sharing with me how difficult his mission was in the streets, how he really didn't feel like he was connecting with Iraqis, and there was a sense of bewilderment about him. He looked at me as this geeky guy from Washington and said, like, well, can this go any better? And as I was staring at him and sitting there in Iraq, I said to myself, you know, I could go into a discourse about civil society or political party formation or liberal democratic institutions and wealth accumulation, all the things that a learned political science toolkit might deliver. But it really didn't seem to be apt or relevant or sufficient for what was around us. And that became even more so after the Arab Spring began. It was clear that we needed new ways to think about the region. So what I'd like to do today is to start from the premise that we're in a period of transition, look at some of the key issues that are on the table in this period of transition, and then show how perhaps ancient histories echo into the present, or patterns of the past and precedents of the past are visible in the present and matter to our diplomacy and to our national security. So first of all, the world has indeed changed from when I joined intelligence in 1985. It was a world that had a Cold War superstructure over it. It was a world in the Middle East where regimes were held together by authoritarian palaces. And essentially, the United States engaged with these palaces rather than engaging with the societies that were complex and flowing beneath the palace. We subcontracted our relationships, and we didn't really know or engage deeply into the histories and into the fabric of these societies. So those social compacts that were governing in the Arab nationalist regimes have almost completely failed. And have plunged the region into a political disorder. The monarchies have fared better because of their ability to extract rents from energy and to subsidize their populations. And they have some religious legitimacy in some cases, but they're also under a significant amount of stress. So that world, if you look in the rearview mirror, that world that we knew in the 20th century, that first sort of reckoning with the post-Ottoman era, is no longer the world we're in. We're now in a world that requires us to think deeply about the following key issues. First is, in this transitional space, what is the strategic intent of actors that are no longer sitting under the constraints of the Cold War architecture of an international system in the region, and that are able to act autonomously and increasingly autonomously in the region? What is the strategic intent, and how do they see their spheres of influence? And where do they see themselves in the region? That's the first challenge. The second challenge is a political challenge. Those social compacts asunder and torn up. How do we rebuild those social compacts? And what are the issues we need to think about beyond just the analytic political science formats that have informed a more stable and now superseded order? We need to think differently about politics. So what are the ways that the ancient world can help us think, first about strategic intent, secondly about political order, thirdly, how about religion? How do we think as people of the post-Enlightenment and post-Westphalian world, how do we think about religion in the public space? That's a key thing. And the last thing we need to think about is the international system and the regional system that is emerging in this region after the post-Cold War era has begun. Just on strategic intent, look at some of the key actors in the region that are going to matter. Turkey, for instance, the way to think about Turkey is not just in an Ataturk nationalist or even a neo-Ottoman Erdogan framework. I think of the Turkey in a geographic space. Look at it as the Anatolian Plateau that has historically sort of seesawed between an orientation to Europe, which would be a NATO-EU orientation that we see today, and an orientation toward the Middle East. This is a pattern that has been going on since the Hittites that has persisted even in the Roman era. There was a balance between Near Eastern and European orientations. The location of Turkey means that it is always going to be moving in between European policy orientation and Near East policy orientation. And that's something that helps us to think about how Turkey sees its interests and how it sees its identity and where it's willing to act. Iran, similarly, if you're not comfortable with Iran being in the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley or Iraq, you need to know that from the Bronze Age, peoples of the Iranian plateau have been looking down upon the wealth and agricultural surpluses of the lower Tigris-Euphrates basin and now the oil, and have sought that wealth. If you don't like Iran's presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's good to know that in the Achaemenid dynasty of 500 BC, that indeed they were already as far as what we would now call Bulgaria. So Iran has antecedents that go well beyond its contemporary borders, including eastward antecedents that go into what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. So understanding Iran's geographic space and will give you understanding of its strategic intent, both in the past and in the present. We can't predict how states are going to act based on the past, but at least we understand how they see their identities and see the strategic space in which they will act. Egypt, similarly, if you wonder about its role in the Arab world, it's helpful to know that they see themselves as the civilization of the Nile, and they see themselves as distinct from the rest of the Arab world and as having some sort of claim to leadership. Those are just some examples of some of the key states. Syria also, why is it that Assad has spent his time guarding the Eastern Mediterranean littoral and effectively yielding the Jazeera or the upper Tigris-Euphrates basin? Well, because Syria has always been a place where you have the wealth of the cities on the Eastern Mediterranean as being the most strategically important, and the upper Tigris Euphrates being a much more lawless and contested space. You need to know that history in order to understand, I think, some of the contemporary choices facing the Syrian regime. On politics, generally the ancient Greeks are not thought of as the first place to go in trying to figure out Arab politics, but I'm going to argue that they are worth considering some of their political experience in order for us to discern strategically what are the issues at play right now in the region. It's also worth noting that the examples that I'm going to give are actually from a period in ancient Greek history that was informed by Near Eastern influences. It is the case that the Hellenic and then the Hellenist worlds were informed by ties to the Near East. So it's not a defense of some reified Greek identity. It's really a cosmopolitan Greece that has ties to the Near East that we should speak of. And there are key ways, I think, that the political moment of social contract reformation, it needs to be informed by the Greek experience. The first is we need to have a sense of citizenship recovered in the Arab world. You cannot function, as the Greeks were to find out when Cleisthenes around 500 looked at the bloodletting that was going on amongst clans and tribes and said, look, we need to have a new political order here where people have allegiance to what we would call a party that is broader than just the ties to family or clan. And he reorganized politics so that people from different regions and different clans were in fact going to cohere together in an ideal of citizenship that is larger than their blood loyalties to groups. Aeschylus will give us separately the idea of the primacy of law, and that needs to be recovered also in the Arab political recovery that needs to happen in the former Arab nationalist regimes. Law, if you look at the trilogy of plays in the Oresteia by Aeschylus, you will see that law matters as a foundation for order. And there's also a little more high altitude view that Homer gives when you read his epic, the Iliad. You get a sense that politics is not just about the moment you're living in, but it's always drawing on something from the past, as his troops sitting on the beaches of Troy will show. And it's always looking forward to the future. This is a good way to conceptualize the Arab political moment too. We're going to have moments of the past coming into this present social compact formation, and it's going to lead to something different that we don't yet articulate. In Homer's case, there was the Bronze Age in the past, there was this sort of Iron Age moment that he was writing in, and then there was this future, more democratic Greece that he was beginning to presage in his epic. So that's a strategic intent, politics, and then quickly looking at the role of religion. This is a toughie for a political class that is schooled in the primacy of the Enlightenment and in the separation of the state from religion in our post-Westphalian settlement, 1648. These are the norms that govern us. But the reality of the region is that governance and religious identities, religious authorities, are always it's an often fusion, if not a close choreographed dance. And there is in this region a great and deep precedent of the relationship between religious knowledge and authority and secular political authority. This means that as we go forward in reconsidering, I think, the compacts that are going to be redone in the Middle East, we're going to have to confront religious issues in perhaps broader ways than we have. We can't just call Islam either something private in the private domain, or worse yet, label it as extremism, or just call it a politics of some other kind. Islam exists in the public space in ancient and enduring ways, and that has to be reckoned with as we deal with social compacts. Liberty, political legitimacy, law, all of those future issues for social compacts will have to have some sort of reckoning with the schools of Islamic jurisprudence that come before them. And we need to think deeply and broadly about the role of religion, notwithstanding some of the constraints that we inherit inevitably as these post-Enlightenment and post-Westphalian folks. The next thing about the region that I think ancient history really helps us with is to think about the system of states. Right now, it's very transitional and uncertain. We had a much more stable order, obviously, in the Cold War. And now we have this paradox of receding international power in many ways, and yet assertive in regional powers inside of the region. We have Iran and Turkey, arguably Israel, less so Egypt. We have all of these forces now asserting themselves in ways that the Cold War had in many ways suppressed. So the question strategically is, how does the ancient world give us any insight into thinking in a useful and strategic way about the system that may be emerging in this region? I think that a fundamental takeaway from ancient echoes and ancient precedents into the region is that there usually is a pattern that goes from unipolar to multipolar system in this region. We go from large empires that break up and go into multipolar competitive arrangements, and then usually reconfigure again into a larger system. I would argue that the Ottoman Empire was that large unipolar moment, and we are continuing to break up into a post-Ottoman, as Michael was referring to, a post-Ottoman world where we have a more multipolar system. Now, that's sort of a basic premise, but more specifically, if you look at the last ancient empire that had a Mediterranean-wide unifying influence and projected into the Near East, it was the Roman world. And thinking critically about the fall of Rome, I'm not talking about just the Germanic assault on the Western Empire, talking about the entire Byzantine Western complex and thinking about the Mediterranean world broadly. When that world ended, largely with the Islamic conquest, you had three worlds come out of it. You had a Western European world. You can think of the United States as sort of appended to that. You had on the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean, you had an Arab Islamic world ultimately emerge from the breakup. And you had on the Anatolian plateau, first Byzantium, and then eventually a Turkish state. These three nodes of the Western Europe and Anatolian plateau and the southern rim, these three parts from the breakup of Rome are good and useful parts to think of how the new system is going to be built. Also in the ancient world, the Iranian influence was always influencing these three parts on the outside, and it's going to continue to do so also. So I think you get a sense of the architecture that is conceptually relevant coming from the ancient world, particularly the Roman end of the Roman world and the fall from a unipolar to a multipolar system. So this helps you look at how to conceptualize. So this is a moment where we're summoned, I think, to do strategic thinking. And strategic thinking is conceptualization. The word in Greek for a general is a strategos, from which we get strategy. What did the strategos have to do? He had to sit up on a hill, basically, and look at how to integrate, lightly armed troops with heavily armed troops and cavalry. The analyst doing strategic analysis, I think, has to do something similar. You have to integrate different narratives that are often shorter term and more tactical into something longer term and conceptually broad enough to be helpful for policymakers to think about this region in transition and how to put their diplomatic opportunities in context, threat perceptions in context, and to see the new Middle East emerging. So we have to be, in a way, strategic, like the general, figuring out how to combine sub-narratives into a larger narrative. And one way to do that, I think, is to bring the tools and insights of ancient history into the mix. And I'll just stop with the key thought. I think that the Middle East is a place where the ancient world resonates for its inhabitants. People do think like this. People do remember and have identities that are much more ancient than we as Americans or often others in the West can have. So with that, I'll yield, and thank you again, Michael, for the invitation.
Well, thank you, and that's a great way to begin the conversation about this, and invite everyone to post a question in the chat, which we'll get to. Andrew, what about new thinking among the inhabitants of the region itself? Because they're faced with all these issues now, which they see. How to reconstitute political order in places that had a secular nation state framework, now what, right? They are also influenced by ideas from the Enlightenment as well as ideas from Islam, and one of the things I think is sort of fascinating, like when you notice when you're looking at these, say, studying the Ba'athist state in Iraq, how they drew on images from the Babylonian Empire. And
Yes, yeah.
when we were a strong state, and that was, but what do they do now? What do you, because, the sort of questions hanging out there was the way that the big cycles of history for the region is, it goes from multipolar to, an imperial system or something, or a dominant hegemon. So, I mean, that would suggest that we're in for an era of more conflict.
Yes, I think we are likely to have a period of more conflict because these things don't happen in the short-term Washington, D.C. timeframe that people would like to have happen. This is a longer, or as the Analysts school in France would say, c'est la longue durée. This is we're looking at structural forces that are going to unfold over time. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think the region, there is evidence of the region caring about its past. Not only did Saddam name Republican Guard divisions after Babylonian kings, but if you look at the political challenge that the region faces, there's basically the inherited borders that are in a de jure sense still holding, but there is a lot of erosion of the de facto borders. And so the social compacts are going to have to deal with, where did spaces and communities exist before these modern borders? And if we want to keep these modern borders, and probably we do, how are we going to come up with political systems that can reconcile a North and South Yemen, an Eastern Mediterranean Syrian littoral with an upper Tigris-Euphrates basin, or Iraq's Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish regions? These are the challenges, and I think the information and technology revolution, yes, has definitely exposed the region to all sorts of liberal ideals that are still very resonant and popular in the region. And the political process is going to have to reconcile the ongoing engagement with modern and in many cases more individualistic and secular ideals that have been circulated from the West. Is going to have to engage with these but on their own terms. The region will be engaging with them on their own terms. It's not something we can impose.
And by the way, when we say region, what do we even mean by that? We have a certain map in our head, and is it the same map that the occupants have? We say, right. And then we look at, somehow we'll look at Afghanistan as being, well, we don't know. We don't call that the Middle East. We call that Central Asia. And I don't think the Iranians think of it that way. And I don't know if the Saudis think of it exactly that way. Certainly they've had a great strategic interest in it. And likewise, what about external actors? I mean, part of your analysis was the role that invaders played in shaping the Middle East.
I think that beginning with the writings of Herodotus, when he talks about Scythians and the steppes, I mean, this is not a region that is self-contained. You forever have had through the strategic passes in the Transcaucasus region, you've had peoples of the steppe moving down. This pattern, where we don't really, although I should say that President Erdogan once was photographed with Mahmoud Abbas with Turkish warriors of various centuries in costume next to him. So if you wonder whether or not this stuff matters to regional leaders, it does. But we're not looking at steppe invaders anymore. But I think conceptually, the steppe external influence on the region matters in a couple of ways. First, think of the Russians and their influence, not in a Cold War, neo-Cold War thing, but think of them as moving from the northern steppe regions, asserting themselves again into the Black Sea and beyond. That's conceptually useful. Similarly, the Belt Road Initiative of China that's moving into the region, that represents in some way, again, a move from the Central Eurasian steppe into this region. So you have to think conceptually of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, but you also have to think of Iran and moving eastward into what are antecedents of Iranian civilization, that they projected power into Afghanistan and into Central Asia. All of that is part of the conceptualization of the region. I don't think we need to get hung up on how to define it as much as we need to know how the actors, where they have reached and who has come in.
Last question, and then let's get to some of the chat. One of the things, of course, that really stands out to me is your discussion of the importance of history in framing this. I think in our programs, we tend to stress a lot of social science applications to problems and strategic intelligence. When we sometimes look, in fact, when we look at issues of intelligence failure, often our solution is more of a social science approach. Do you think that perhaps we've been overlooking the important role of history in helping us solve problems that, like, for example, the issue of mirror imaging?
Yeah, I think mirror imaging can sometimes happen if we look at the region from, frankly, it's still a 1950s modernization theoretical construct where there's technological revolution and economic progress need to eventually overcome traditional society. And if we go with that somewhat self-referential social science perspective on the region, and admittedly, modernization has receded as something that is taken very seriously now in the academy, but it still seems to have echoes and influence in the way we look at the region. I think that the social science toolkit tends to get us into that modernization corner in a way we don't want to go, and the historical framework allows us to think broader about and more broadly about the potential solutions for these key strategic problems. What is the intent of actors? How will social compacts be made? Where will religion fit into the compacts, and how will the system be reordered? Social science may not be sufficient for that. We still need it. My wife has a PhD in government and social science, so I'm very deferential, but it's not necessarily sufficient for the moment in a region that just thinks deeply historically.
All right, let me get to a few questions from Josh. In this conception of unipolar and multipolar setups, where do the caliphates fit? Was that a multipolar grouping or a unipolar empire?
I think that you can give credit to the Umayyads going, you argue from the death of the Prophet in 632 right up to the fall of the Umayyad and the transition to the Abbasid Caliphate in 750, maybe extend that to the mid 9th century. That would be definitely in the unipolar framework. But in the mid 9th century, you start to see the Abbasids begin to break up. And that is, again, making that pattern of going from unipolar to multipolar. Just when we're talking about the Abbasids, by the way, if you worry about Khorasan movement and terrorism today, this sort of discussion is an example of why we need to be literate about these things. Khorasan is a region from which these Abbasid revolutionaries, Arab and Persians, got together to overthrow what perceived corrupt Umayyads. And if you don't know what Khorasan means, and if you don't know the sort of piety and self-appointed revolutionary spirit that comes in the movement named Khorasan, you're missing out on strategic intent.
Well, they've read the history, and that's pretty clear from their rhetoric, and
right.
They've read it, and they had a map of it. And that was something I think, just an aside, when I was in I was out of the government, but the ISIS's own historical conception brought them into Kurdistan, thought of themselves as being in Kurdistan, right? And that was something I don't think we were that attuned to.
Good example. Yeah.
Okay, let me add another question from Bob. You and many of us have tried to present broad conceptual matters to busy customers in the senior ranks of the policymaking world. How do you view the challenges of moving policymakers from the quick shoot from the hip perspective to thinking the way you're describing?
Well, I may be in a minority on this, but I think that in an era of visualization and digitization, we still need to make a defense for long form writing, and we still need to make a defense for the argumentation that comes in a well-structured written argument. It doesn't have to be a massively long piece that will unrealistically never actually be read by a busy policymaker, but the thinking that long form argumentation and research provides for a short brief to a senior policymaker needs to happen. And I think that you can be visual in conveying for a busy policymaker some of these insights, but we need not to yield to atomized disciplines and atomized bureaucratic structures, and also atomized thought. We need to be more integrative, and we need to have the ability still, in a world that is anti-narrative and anti-grand narrative, we still need to say things that are synthetic and coherent, and that do not spin off centrifugally because of so many different disciplines and collections and all. But we need to cohere. We need to cohere in our message.
And, you know, I was just speaking to a former policymaker and asking a similar question. And she said, now more than ever, we need to be doing it. That is, as an intelligence community, because there's just simply too much information for policymakers to process in any type of coherent way.
Right, right.
All right, another question from Barbara. Are US and other Western policymakers today equipped to deal with this region as they shift focus to ostensibly more understandable conflict between China and Russia? How can analysts influence understanding as the focus shifts?
Well, I would argue that there is a case to be made, and it has been made by many senior policymakers in the press recently even, that there are enduring interests in the Middle East for the United States, that a shift of strategic focus to China and or Russia does not eclipse. We still have to worry about this region. So I think that that's the essential messages that we can't put ourselves out of business just because there are other priorities. There has to be an understanding of still energy interests, there are refugee flows into Western Europe, and there is, of course, extremism, and all of that has asymmetric consequences for us. So it is a challenge, but it's not one that I think we should shy away from.
Well, you know, it's part of our, I think, a little bit of the way things are described often in the media is, you know, they'll talk about, you know, US retreating from the region, when in fact, we're just going back to where we were. We have a military presence in several places. We've had these agreements with countries in the region in several places. That was something that has been a norm for decades. So we're still a player in the region in a very significant way. It seems to me that it's you know, we're not disengaging from it in that sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's still a pattern of the U.S. as a maritime power, principally being able to project you know, force into this region, and also having established some terrestrial land, you know, capabilities as well. So we may not be doing major ground operations and occupations, thankfully, but we certainly will be able to be relevant there.
Another question on history from Barbara: is anybody trained in history these days, and does hiring systems for intelligence jobs understand the need? That's interesting.
I think the number of folks that are trained in history and the humanities in general is probably declining, and as the remuneration and the economy skews toward more quantitative skills. And I think also that history as a discipline is becoming increasingly influenced by new technologies in archaeology and more data sets, and that's also affecting the writing of narratives. I would argue that the hiring process in government should include the people that have the critical thinking skills that comes from preparation anything from classical languages, history, area studies, culture. These are relevant fields for much of the world, not just the Middle East. And I think that some of the dominance of the social sciences has to yield to a recognition that in the humanities there is an understanding of facts, precedents, and identities that are very germane for bottom line U.S. national security interests.
In your book, you mentioned the Analyst School when we were just speaking about it before. And when I was reading it, I was thinking of Christopher Dawson and the type of sort of big picture history that he specialized in. And I don't think this is taught anymore. And this gets back to sort of an academy question that you had mentioned earlier, and I think comes out in the book is in some ways the academy is working against us. I say us, but I mean, in trying to develop this type of broader historical thinking about the region. It's just not set up that way anymore.
Yeah, I think we went beginning in the 1970s. There was a great movement to sort of deorientalize the study of the Middle East, and one of that may have had many virtues in getting more of the voices of the region back into the discourse. But an unfortunate side effect has been there's been this I think almost a postmodern attack on meaningful narratives, large narratives, and reducing everything to much more situational and fragmented pieces that are, I think, harder for a policymaker to use in relevant ways. So I'm arguing for I'm not arguing for recovery of any of the bad old days of sort of 19th and early 20th century views of the region, but I'm arguing for a little bit of a pushback against some of the atomization and the discrediting of large narrative discourse that takes history seriously. We simply have to be able to talk about history in a respectful and serious way if we're going to equip our policymakers for engagement.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly, and Barbara, to answer your question as well. I had some background in recruiting myself, and I always felt if we, somebody with a history background was very attractive, especially if they had some regional experience and were of course studying the languages. But it seemed like from the going from the intelligence position, it seemed like that type of student made a good transition and into the work we were doing. And that, let me get back, let's talk a little bit about you, Andrew, because one of the part of your book has some autobiographical moments, and I wondered if how you thought about this is in terms of your career and how it prepared you for what you wanted to do, and do you think that because it's unusual, it's something of an unusual academic background,
Right.
even for us it was unusual.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you, when I was an undergrad at Harvard studying comparative religion, I think my parents were just wringing their hands in despair at where this was all going to lead. But I will say that 3 decades later, I found myself essentially leading the analysis about Islam and society. And if I hadn't learned the language, thank you, University of Chicago, for giving to Harvard the right language to talk about religion in anthropological and less theological terms, to talk about religious identity in ways that would be understandable to somebody who's post-Westphalian and post-Enlightenment. If I hadn't had that, that would have been, I think, a difficult thing. And if I hadn't had some preparation in classics, I don't think when I'm walking around the region as a U.S. government official, literally, from the ruins of Carthage all the way to Jerash in Jordan and down into the lower Tigris Euphrates, I have been primed to actually see the ancient world by having studied it a little bit. And you see the ancient world if you've been given some glasses that can look at the ancient world, and it doesn't just go over your head as this sort of this atmospherics. It has meaning. And I think I remember standing along the Tigris River and thinking, when I saw the Tigris River with currents, thinking, wow, what did the Mongols actually do with the House of Wisdom's library and toss all that Sanskrit and Chinese and Arabic wisdom into the water? What did that mean? And it felt very real. So these matter because the world is not just an engineering project. It has complex issues of identity, faith, and political compacting that we absolutely have to be literate about.
Right. I think that very nicely said, and it's nice to see and how this applies, and the framework that you're discussing, this type of approach to looking at problems in the Middle East, and that's your specialty. But how would you suggest that for others? I mean, they're looking at different parts of the world. Where we have something of a Barbara mentioned, Russia and China. Well, what about places like that? I mean, how can we use this kind of concept?
I will not speak with any claim to deep expertise on these other issues, but I'll just say that it appears to me, as somebody who thinks as a Byzantinist now, if you look at Russia, you really want to have an understanding of sort of how Russian and Orthodox civilization interact with each other, and how does Russian political leadership see itself in the context of Russian history that goes back to Vladimir's conversion to the Byzantine faith there. China, I think, again, it's helpful to look at what's happening in China's strategic ambitions and ask, what are the antecedents? How do they see, what does the South China Sea matter to them in historical terms? How do they see themselves now having modernized? How does their ancient identity resonate and penetrate inside their modern capabilities? You have to be able to identify civilizational patterns in their modern form, because civilizational patterns will endure. There will be ancient echoes in civilizations, Russian, Chinese, or Middle Eastern. And I think the Iranian and Turkish examples are not unique to the world, or the Egyptian. They're held elsewhere. Americans don't really speak like this because we're relatively young, and we resonate with the Enlightenment basically as our sort of political project, and that's much more recent. We need to remember that.
Yeah, that's often our framework for looking at the world, and a lot of our students. I mean, I think it's a very interesting thing that they bring this up, and their concern with us mirror imaging problems, which suggests to me that they're able to sort of step aside from their own American culture and look at things in maybe the way that our potential adversaries, or not even adversaries, but just allied countries with problems, look at it, and how we need to be concerned about that. I think it's very encouraging from the students we have in our program that they're asked this question, and I think you're helping them provide an answer to it.
I really want to speak as somebody who's been on the front lines. I mean, this is not a sort of intellectually sort of abstract discursus. This is actually operationally, for me, it's a proven and relevant way to look at difficult problems, to think more deeply and more historically.
There's something of a I don't know if it's a trend, but I think there's a little bit of downplaying of the importance of strategic intelligence as part of the interplay between the policymaker and the intelligence community. That perhaps the strategic intelligence hasn't played a big role in major policy decisions. In your experience, and especially since you've had a lot of interaction with policymakers, and we're doing strategic intelligence at a high level, what's your experience and how receptive they are to these type of messages?
Well, my experience was that we had extremely educated and thoughtful and capable policymakers. And it's really on the analysts to make the case that this is worth You know, this, with a busy policymaker, there's always an opportunity cost. You're asking her or him to not do something while they download whatever you're offering them. And so if you really are going to make the case for strategic analysis, it has to be rigorously argued, and it has to be relevant to their needs. You know, you have to show why a conceptual framework of societal change or international system change or social compact change is relevant to the pursuit of U.S. interests. And if you can keep that in mind, and you can be succinct and you can keep it in front of them as relevant, then I think you're in the door, because they certainly are like any policymaker. They're open to what's practical and useful. And so it's on the analyst's job to show that strategic thinking is operationally useful.
Right. Well, finally, I mean, let's end today with just talking a little bit about just how you see things. I mean, we've had kind of a traumatic moment since August, watching a 20-year war come to an end with a whimper, you know, and you've got one thinking about a lot of our role in the region, our encounter with that brand of Islam, with the Taliban, and then what comes next. I mean, based on what you think in your experience, I mean, what do you see how an issue like that breaks out?
Well, I mean, specifically the Afghanistan end, and how do
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm thinking about, like, okay, you know, so they have a model, they have a conceptual model on how to restore order, how to come up with a social compact, right? And they're going to get a chance to redo this experiment. So yeah, so I mean, that's one group of people who have one idea in the region on how to do it, and they'll have opponents from within the region on that. So how does this come out, if you're thinking about it in broader terms?
Well, on the negative side for the United States, it's not really easy for us to claim sort of inherent standing in the sensitive matters of how the issues of Islam governance and in the Afghan context are going to be sorted out in the context of the Pushtun tribal dominance. We don't have standing in that debate. But on the good news side, though, is that Islam itself has such diversity, and there are different schools of jurisprudence that still function, in addition, as alternative ways of approaching these problems to the ones that the Taliban are offering in basically a Hanbali school of a narrow school of jurisprudence. There are other schools that have more receptivity to different ways of broadening the political base and reconciling even Western freedoms and legal ideas with Islamic revelation. And there's also, beyond the four schools of jurisprudence, there's this, you know, democratization of the jurisprudence space that has come with the rise of information and technologies, that people are doing creative things outside of the traditional domains of Islamic jurisprudence. And that is something that I think we should be aware of and looking at, because the most compelling and durable solutions are going to come autochthonously from within the region. And I think that discourse is something we may not have a lot of standing in, but it's worth us understanding.
Right. Well, very good. We're coming about to the end of our program now. I want to thank Andrew Gilmour for being with us. This was extremely interesting and engaging. I welcome you to, if you haven't already, look for his book. I read it, keep up on his writings, and we hope to have you back soon and talk to us more about it, Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And that's probably our last program on Inside Intelligence this year, but join us in January, where the former Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, Kimberly Breyer, will be with us to talk about Latin America. So thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.